In this video, we will cover the conclusion of Chapter 1 of MacIntyre's Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity. Now, up to this point, we've been discussing the main topic of this chapter, which is the opposition between Expressivism on the one hand and Neo-Aristotelianism on the other. And you will recall that Expressivism is the view that ethical language, using terms, words such as good and bad, right and wrong, vicious and virtuous, and so forth, our use of these terms merely reflects an expression of our attitudes. It expresses, in particular, our commitment to norms. So, roughly speaking, it expresses our values. It expresses those norms that we have come to adopt, have come to commit ourselves to, have come to allow to govern our attitudes, our feelings, and so forth. But ultimately, this commitment to the norms is something that is non-rational. It is not based, that is, on a correspondence to some extra mental, objective moral reality of any sort. So there's no truth or falsity when it comes to matters of ethics. It's merely an expression of our attitudes fundamentally, in particular our commitment to norms. And this is in contrast to a Neo-Aristotelian perspective, which is the perspective that MacIntyre favors, which is based on the view that there is fundamentally a fact of the matter about human flourishing. What constitutes human flourishing is going to be a subject of an ongoing debate, perhaps even an interminable debate, because it's going to depend upon changing historical circumstances. It's going to depend upon the social context in which an individual human being finds herself. But at the same time, there is this guiding idea that there is a truth to be discovered about human flourishing. And this is something that is found out typically through the exercise of practical reasoning in contexts of actual practical life and reflection upon those engagements with practical life, which allow us to assess our failures, to correct ourselves, to learn from others, and to form a more adequate idea of what human flourishing consists in. And so we're trying to get at the truth. We're trying to get at the truth of what it really is for a human being to flourish and to conform ourselves to that. And so that is one way to think about the fundamental contrast between expressivism and Neo-Aristotelianism. It's over this question about whether there really is ethical truth, whether ethics is just fundamentally an expression of our attitudes and preferences that ultimately cannot be given a rational justification, or whether there is a rational justification that is rooted in truths about human nature and about what really constitutes human flourishing. Now, beginning in section 6 of chapter 1, MacIntyre takes up the question of moral development. He thinks that the conflict between expressivism and Neo-Aristotelianism can be illuminated by examining a particular use of the word good that's related to how we understand the process of moral development. When we describe a particular woman as a good mother, this use of good, MacIntyre observes, has something in common with the use of good in such phrases as good farmer or good machine. Namely, that the subject being described as good flourishes to the extent that the object in its care is given what it needs to flourish. So the good mother is good insofar as she is flourishing, thriving as a mother. And how do we determine that? Well, we determine that in terms of whether her child is thriving and flourishing, or at least in terms of whether the child is being given the care and the resources that it needs by the mother in order to, in the normal course of events, thrive and flourish. leaving aside accidents and things, of course, that might interrupt that. And that's in the way in which we assess a good farmer or someone who's flourishing if the crops that the farmer is charged with caring for are flourishing. That's what makes a good farmer a good farmer. And a good machine is a good machine if it's operating in such a way as to provide the assistance that the machine is intended to provide to people. So this is apparently an Aristotelian dimension of the good. It's related to the idea of something functioning well or flourishing, but in particular, in order, or its flourishing is assessed in terms of whether the object that it is acting upon is functioning well or flourishing. However, there's also an expressivist dimension to this use of good. To call someone a good mother is to express a set of desires as well, and consequent approvals and disapprovals, especially if you think about the reflective use of this, where a particular woman would say, oh, I'm worried that I'm not a good mother. This is the concern that MacIntyre mentions the psychologist D.W. Winnicott was interested in treating, helping new mothers' anxiety about whether they are a good mother. So, when a mother asks herself, am I a good mother? Or I want to be a good mother, they're expressing something. There's an expressivist dimension here. They're expressing a set of desires, a set of commitments to norms, you might say, approvals and disapprovals that follow from these commitments and desires. So MacIntyre proposes to use an examination of moral development, which of course is a major part of the good that a good mother wants for her child to morally develop. He proposes to use this examination of moral development as a means of examining, he says, what is neo-Aristotelian and what is expressivist in this family of uses of good. So I think really what's going on here is just a kind of testing of these moral theories against the fact that should be uncontroversial and indisputable, is that children have to learn to become moral agents. They have to undergo a process of moral development in order to be initiated into the moral world, in which they can use terms like good and bad, right and wrong, virtuous and vicious, together with others in human community. And so this process of moral development, whatever our theory tells us, it should provide some kind of a plausible account of the process of moral development. MacIntyre doesn't quite set it up this way, but I think it's fair to see him as suggesting this idea as well. How do neo-Aristotelianism and expressivism fare in terms of being able to provide us with a plausible account of moral development, or how do they fit the evident facts of moral development? So the process of moral development in children must accomplish two things. First, it must enable us as adults to use the word good to provide reasons for treating one object of desire as better than its rivals. So we clearly sometimes desire things that we have to check if we are to become morally developed adults. So we have to be able to distinguish, in other words, between those desires that are good desires and those desires that are bad desires. I really want to punch you right now, but I recognize that's bad. So a 2-year-old child doesn't have that ability. So sometime between when I was 2 and now, I've come to develop the ability to hold myself in check by this kind of moral constraint, and that involves being able to use the term good to distinguish between desires, those desires that are good and those desires that are not. So that's the first thing that moral development requires us to do. And second, it must train us to be motivated by the conclusions of our practical reasoning. So this is one reason why a psychopath is in some sense a state of moral arrested development, because they were never able to develop the ability to be motivated. They might be able to make these judgments. They might have learned how to make judgments between good and bad according to the way they've observed other people make these judgments, but they don't feel motivated by that. So that's the second aspect of moral development, not just to enable us to use the moral language in a way to differentiate between our desires, but also to train our desires, such as we desire to act as reason directs us. So those two elements in moral development, teaching us to use the moral language and training our desires. Now, the initial motive in moral development is the desire for the parent's approval and the fear of the parent's disapproval. Initially, we're motivated by emotion, in particular the desires for love and the aversion to being disapproved of and the fear of the parent's disapproval. It's only subsequently that the parent will begin to offer reasons for discriminating between objects of desire in the hope that the child will recognize these as being good reasons. So initially, the parent's just going to say, don't do that, in a stern tone of voice. So the child, desiring the parent's approval and afraid of punishment, will do what the parent says, at least ideally, unless the child's a real brat. But eventually, of course, a good parent is going to start to give reasons for why you shouldn't do that. Don't have that cookie. You're going to ruin your appetite, and you're not going to grow up big and strong, etc., etc. Right? Or more recognizably moral reasons, like don't pull your sister's hair. How would you feel if she did that to you? This sort of thing. And so part of this process is that children at some point are held to account for their actions and are asked to justify them. Billy, why did you do that? Why did you do that? Typically, this isn't something that, a parent is going to ask a very young child, at least not if they're a good parent. But at some point, the child gets to a certain age and they do something and you say, why did you do that? You know better than that. Why did you do that? And as reflective agents, these young human beings eventually learn to be able to give arguments in support of their actions, which explain what goods they hope to achieve by them. This is the dimension, especially of excuses, right? You hope to give an argument that you're explaining, well, I was trying to do this. This is why I did this, because I was trying to get this. And if they do hope to achieve goods, then eventually they have to learn to direct their desires as reason directs them. So the child has to learn what actually is really good, as opposed to what is perhaps just tempting at this particular point in time, and then learn to train their desire so that they desire most to do those things that it's most reasonable to desire. That is, the things that are going to actually achieve real goods. This procedure by which the child becomes a rational and accountable moral agent reminds of Aristotle's account of decision. The term is proheresis in Greek, which was translated as decision in Ehrman's translation. Literally, the Greek root word would be something like meaning choosing before. It's decision in Irwin. And then MacIntyre suggests translating this as rational wanting. So it's a kind of, unlike decision, which can seem perhaps for us maybe overly intellectual, the idea is that proheresis is when we've arrived at a proheresis through deliberation, we've sort of adjusted our wants so that what we want is what reason has told us to want. Remember that proheresis for Aristotle is the outcome of deliberation. And so rational wanting has that sense of we undergo deliberation so that what perhaps we initially want is made or transformed or molded into a rational wanting as the outcome of deliberation. MacIntyre cites Anscombe. Rational wanting is wanting something qua, that is under the description of conducive to our doing well or flourishing. So that's what rational wanting is. Wanting something qua conducive to our flourishing. This be helpful to put this under scare quotes here, just to suggest this is the description. So we want something, but we want it because we see it as conducive to our flourishing, and so that has to be the outcome of deliberation in a rational human being. So this is how the process of moral development goes. We start out with irrational wants. And then eventually, under the influence of reason, first external to us in the form of our parents who are reasoning for us, as it were. And then eventually, gradually, we come to reason for ourselves. Our desires come to be rational wants. That's the process, from irrational wants to rational wants, with the intervention in between of reason, first externally in the form of our parents who are sort of surrogate reasoners for us when we're not able to do it for ourselves, and then gradually we come to do it for ourselves. And all of this is going to aim at what is conducive to our flourishing, which is what reason is going to tell us. Now, this account of moral development still doesn't show that the neo-Aristotelian is right about good and its meaning, because the expressivists will point out that it leaves undetermined how the particular view of human flourishing that the child has gets formed. And the expressivist is going to insist, well, of course, this view comes from pre-rational endorsements of evaluations and moral judgments that are due to the individual's upbringing and culture. You know, the expressivist, as it were, says to the neo-Aristotelian, Mr. and Ms. Neo-Aristotelian, what you're calling human flourishing is just sort of what their parents indoctrinated them to believe was the way a human being should be. And of course, that's going to be pre-rational. It's not going to be something that is itself the outcome of phronesis or anything like that, practical reasoning, prudence. It comes from pre-rational endorsements of evaluations and moral judgments. And of course, we know that different parents can have different evaluations and moral judgments. And so impart to their children different views about what so-called quote-unquote human flourishing is. It's really, you know, this is the expression of mom and dad's attitudes towards what should be approved and what should be disapproved. And that's the expressivist view as to what's really going on here. So the expressivist is going to hold that there's no fact of the matter about human flourishing. And if our locutions about human flourishing suggest otherwise, then this can be accounted for by translating factual language into language about desires, feelings, and attitudes, what Simon Blackburn called quasi-realism. Now, MacIntyre would hold that the best Aristotelian response to this is to catalog the known facts about human failures to flourish. And this is what he gives the bottom of page 39. He says, so these are, these are facts. These are not opinions. These are not attitudes of approval or disapproval towards things, but these are facts about human failures to flourish. So there are failures resulting from malnutrition, injury, and ill health. There are failures of otherwise deprived and materially or culturally impoverished lives. There are failures that are a consequence of laziness or incompetence in an agent's preparing her or himself through self-discipline and the acquisition of skills for various types of rewarding activity. There are failures that result from an agent sacrificing either the present to the future or the future to the present. There are failures that are due to an agent's inadequate relationships with others, so that there's a lack of badly needed cooperation, and the agent does not learn from those others what it is of great importance for her or him to learn. So I invite you to look at that again, that passage from the bottom of page 39. This is the rejoinder to this idea that there's some subjectivity in the notion of human flourishing. What all these facts have in common is that they've prevented, in some significant respect, the agent's realization of her human powers and potentialities. To recover from such cases of failure when they occur in life, an agent must learn from the experience. And such learning will involve either an acknowledgement of the agent's deficiencies as a rational agent, or else a recognition that the agent's prior judgments about what is conducive to her flourishing have been falsified by experience, so that her conception of the good needs to be revised. So you find yourself in a situation where you're aware that, for example, I don't find this job that I have rewarding. And I go back and I trace and I try to arrive at an understanding of whether that is because, I was too lazy to work at that job, whether it was because, I had a wrong idea as to what would be a rewarding job for a human being in the first place, etc. Or whether it was because, I've been ill. I mean, it could be a whole bunch of different things. And so we have to test our judgments and our prohairesis, our rational wants, the things that we believe we rationally want, against our experience. So MacIntyre certainly doesn't want to say that there's some easy formula for arriving at a notion of flourishing, but that doesn't mean that there aren't certain facts that determine the parameters within which flourishing can occur. Failures are occasions for discovering what's true and false and growing in understanding about what the good in fact is. Now, the expressivist response is going to be that there's nothing in this catalog of moral failures beyond an active endorsement expressive of a particular speaker's attitudes, feelings, and commitments. So the Neo-Aristotelian and the expressivists are going to disagree about the interpretation of these alleged facts. What the Neo-Aristotelian sees as argument and inquiry, the expressivist sees as mere rhetoric. And this suggests we've reached another impasse, but something has been discovered. It's been discovered that expressivism and Neo-Aristotelianism are, in fact, incompatible. Expressivism is not neutral between, rival normative theories, that is, views about what the guiding standard of the ethical life should be, because it rules this one out. Okay. This leads us to section 7, which is entitled Instructive Conflicts Between an Agent's Judgments and Her Desires, Expressivists, Frankfurt, and Nietzsche. The expressivist allows for a wide variability in the kinds of normative and evaluative commitments that an agent may express. So it's consistent with a utilitarian commitment, or it's consistent with some demanding conception of duty, like a samurai code or something like that. It's consistent with a commitment to human rights, or a flexible commitment to a variety of norms to varying degrees. So you could say, in this sphere of life, I'm a utilitarian, but when it comes to this sphere of life, I believe in the protection of human rights. In this sphere of life, I believe in some kind of a warrior code, whatever. You could balance these different commitments. You have your own personal sort of, pick your own bouquet of commitments. Now, according to the expressivists, it's possible to rationally adjust and balance one's various normative commitments. And MacIntyre asks, what counts as a reason in this process? So I have these various commitments and I decide, okay, well, now I'm going to use this commitment as my guiding force. In other words, let's say I'm going to put aside my general commitment to utilitarian promotion of maximizing well-being in this particular instance, and I'm going to instead opt for, following the samurai code, even recognizing this is not going to maximize well-being. But In this instance, I'm going to do this. Well, why? Why do I do that in this instance? Or maybe I'm going to say, well, maybe now I'm not going to follow the samurai code. Instead, I'm going to respect human rights in this instance. Why? Well, there must be some reason, because we're assuming that the expressivist is rivaling the Aristotelian position as an adequate, an equally good account of human rationality, human practical rationality. So I can't just be making these choices for no reason. There has to be some reason. And so what counts as a reason? And here's, we get the expressivist account of reason. This is the one from Alan Gibbard. A reason is a consideration that a norm that the agent accepts tells her to treat as weighing in favor of doing something. A reason is a norm, is a consideration that a norm that an agent accepts tells her to treat as weighing in favor of doing something. So, for example, I mean, if I accept the norm, if I accept the greatest happiness principle as a norm, I'm committed to promoting the greatest happiness of the greatest number, then the fact that a particular action would cause you pain is going to be a reason to refrain from that action, because it's a consideration that the norm that I accept, namely the greatest happiness principle, tells me weighs against doing that action, because it would not promote the greatest happiness. So that's the idea of it. Now, of course, you can have the idea of weighing suggests, of course, that you can have opposing reasons and then you have to weigh them against one another. But one thing to notice about this is this norm here for the expressivist is itself a pre-rational state of mind. That is, given this account of reason, there can be no reasons for accepting a norm. So this whole act of a norm that the agent accepts, this cannot be for a reason. That would make the definition of reason here circular. So the norm that one accepts must be a pre-rational state of mind. And this creates a potential conflict within the agent between what she desires and what she regards as good. As MacIntyre describes on right in the center of page 42, bottom of the second paragraph. On occasions when there is some large disagreement between what some agent, in accordance with the particular set of norms that she accepts, judges that it is good and best for her to be, do, or have, and what the agent passionately and deeply desires, then she can have no further reason for identifying with her judgments rather than with her desires, or with her desires rather than with her judgments. What is she to do in this predicament? So what happens when you have some strong desires and then you have some particular set of norms that say it's good for you to do something else? How do you decide whether you should follow your desires or whether you should follow what your norms you accept tell you is good? The agent faces here an existential choice between her conception of the good and her desire. Now, at this point, MacIntyre once again introduces the idea that Nietzsche would invite the expressivist agent to investigate the sources of her ideas of the good, using genealogy, what Nietzsche calls genealogy, his method for retracing the origin of our moral values. Moral values for Nietzsche are expressions of the resentment of the herd against the strong, who are able to just impose their will, and the herds tells them to tamp that down because they resent the power and the strength of the person who has a stronger will. Under the influence of Nietzsche, the reflective agent will take into consideration how they came to make the judgments they do and to have the desires they have. How did I come to accept these norms? The reflective agent will produce a genealogical narrative of her desires. She will ask how far she identifies with her judgments and how far she identifies with her desires. Now, this may issue in a particular kind of reflective awareness that was analyzed by Harry Frankfurt, 20th century American moral philosopher. This is the awareness of what she cares about. So Frankfurt famously discussed the importance of what we care about. What we care about. This, we reflect and we discover what we care about. Some things we can't help caring about. For example, what we love. So for Frankfurt, what we love provides reasons for action. Frankfurt, however, is like the expressivist in that he thinks that our preferences are ultimately determined by final ends that reason can play no part in selecting. So it's kind of like Hume's view, MacIntyre suggests that ultimately you can't give a reason for why you desire what you desire, why you love what you love. That's just the way it is. That's kind of the explanatory bedrock of your practical reasoning, is that, well, this is just what I care about, this is what I love, this is what I desire. But Hume drew a famously extreme conclusion from this. He said, it's not contrary to reason for me to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the pricking of my finger. That, you know, when it comes to desires, there's no criterion of rational critique that we can apply to our desires, because desires are, as it were, above reason in the order of precedence and sort of in the order of providing governing norms. So how does Frankfurt avoid this extreme conclusion, which most reasonable people will regard as too extreme? That surely there must be some way that we can critique our desires, especially if they're what most people regard as absurd or irrational desires, like preferring the destruction of the whole world to having my finger pricked. How does he avoid the extremity of Hume's conclusion? How does Frankfurt, that is? Who's the Humean here? Well, Frankfurt invents this notion that he calls volitional rationality. I won't write this down because it's not too important, but the point is just that volitional rationality is meant to be a kind of complement, a supplement to more theoretical rationality, which is what Hume was saying. It's not contrary, isn't contrary to reason. That is, it's not contrary to something like the laws of logic, law of non-contradiction, for me to prefer one thing to another. But Frankfurt would want to say, well, it is contrary to this thing called volitional rationality, which he associates with sort of things that belong to our nature, like, for example, preferring self-preservation over pricking our finger. Things like this belong to volitional rationality, just part of the structure of the will, part of the structure of our nature. But MacIntyre asks, where does this come from? It doesn't come from some independent normative reality. It comes from this thing that's supposed to be identified with our nature. MacIntyre imagines that the reflective post-Nietzschean agent will understand her goods and her desires as only relative to her or people like her, and not as rooted in some kind of human nature or idea of human nature. And her own self-ordering of her desires in light of her conception of her self-knowledge will be the ultimate source of her reasons. So that's a divergence, in other words, between this option that Frankfurt suggests and the Nietzschean, suggesting that there's no reason for one to regard some idea of human nature, what normal people think or do, as normative for you. And that is precisely the attitude that Nietzsche took. That what matters is what you think is good for you, what you desire, not what normal people normally desire. And that's where this idea of human nature presumably would have to come from. So if you're a Nietzschean, then this sort of extreme position still beckons as an option, that you might prefer your own desire to, the destruction of all humanity. But there's more to it than this, because a Nietzschean is not going to be just a wanton, that is W-A-N-T-O-N, a person who just sort of, like an animal, just impulsively follows whatever their strongest desire is at the moment. That would be a subhuman position. And for a Nietzschean, the kind of agent he's imagining as a superior agent is superhuman, famously. And so such a person is going to have a kind of self-ordering of their desires in light of their conception of self-knowledge. The Nietzschean agent is the supremely self-aware, self-knowing agent who knows what he wants and knows the order of precedence and hierarchy, the rank ordering of his desires. How does the Nietzschean agent arrive at this kind of sovereign self-control and self-knowledge? It's based on a narrative of his life. So the MacIntyrean imagination of this Nietzschean agent, who, unlike Nietzsche probably would have described it, is not a he but a she. She, the Nietzschean agent that MacIntyre imagines, will base her reasons on a narrative of her life that she constructs. And this is a quite common view of what the guiding idea for Nietzsche would be, this idea of a sort of a self-constructed, self-fashioned life based upon a narrative of one's life that one constructs. You find this developed in Alexander Nehamas's conception of Nietzsche, for example, his book entitled Nietzsche, Life as Literature. So this narrative of your life is going to allow you to order, rank order, become aware of, and form as a kind of coherent whole your various desires that are your desires. And the whole that is formed is going to be something that you have created as a kind of artist of your own character, not accepting any norms or any normative standards or anything outside of your own self-constructed life. So at the same time, not even Nietzsche really escapes a conception of human nature, because this narrative itself will be grounded in Nietzsche's own more general account of human nature, which is based on the idea that all life is will to power. So for him, of course, we can ask, what makes the superior, what makes the inferior human being? It has to do with power, the degree of power of the will. Anti-expressivist views for Nietzsche, like a neo-Aristotelianism, would be due to a lack of will on the part of those who hold them, who are unable to stand apart on their own 2 feet and have to cling to some idea of natural law, for example, because they're not able to just assert themselves as the being their own law. So they say, well, I'm only doing this because the natural law tells me to do it. Right? So that's a lack of will. Those who hold anti-expressivist views cannot or will not acknowledge that they are cooperating with the imposition on them of constraints that masquerade as constraints of reason. So society or the church or your parents have told you that this is the only reasonable thing for you to do, and you've sort of gone along because of your weak will. That's the view. So Nietzscheans are going to view Aristotelians as having a false and corrupting view of the human condition. On page 48, MacIntyre describes what he takes to be the Nietzschean attitude towards the Aristotelian. So this is this expressivist Nietzschean. Remember, we're switching between these terms here, but for MacIntyre, the expressivist is sort of a natural Nietzschean. I mean, you wouldn't have to necessarily be a Nietzschean to be an expressivist. So, but the critique of Nietzscheanism and the critique of expressivism for him go together. So this is the Nietzschean's critique of the Aristotelian, and by implication, the way a certain kind of expressivist at least could critique an Aristotelian. So this is expressed from that perspective, not from MacIntyre's own perspective, but from the perspective of a Nietzschean. So the Nietzschean says, To be an Aristotelian is to be a doubly defective human being, one who both suffers from that depression of the emotions to a harmless mean, this is quoting from Nietzsche here, that depression of the emotions to a harmless mean at which they may be satisfied, the Aristotelianism of morals, and is a victim of, quote once again, the disciplined thinkers imposed upon themselves to think under Aristotelian presuppositions, unquote. A discipline that Nietzsche classifies with other medieval habits of mind as arbitrary and anti-rational, belonging to a protracted unfreedom of the spirit, the Nietzschean phrase. One that issues in conformist and sterile habits of mind and spirit. So that's the Nietzschean perspective. Now, what about the neo-Aristotelian conception of the rational agent? This is what we get in section 8. MacIntyre writes, quote, on any Aristotelian view, we can only understand adequately what it is for human beings to flourish by developing an account of the structures of human activity and of how our uses of good and its cognates find application within and to these structures. It's page 49. So what does MacIntyre mean by structures of human activity? The key notion here is that of a practice, Children learn to value and to desire what is good just because it is good in the context of a variety of practices. So remember, we have this kind of classical Aristotelian idea that the virtuous person desires the good, but they desire it also because it is good, merely because it is good. They desire it, in other words, for its own sake, for the sake of its own goodness. They have a rational wanting for what appears to them correctly, if they're truly virtuous, as conducive to their flourishing, and they desire it because of its goodness, because that it appears that way to them. But MacIntyre adds to this the idea that this occurs in the context of a variety of practices. This is a key idea of MacIntyre's. So we learn things that are, as you might say, intrinsically good for their own sake, within the context of practices, because within that practice, it's seen as being something that's good for its own sake. Like within the practice of the various sports, good sportsmanship is a good that's good for its own sake, but only within the context of that practice. It's necessary to achieve the goods of that practice. Because after all, being a good baseball player, let's say, is a good that can be achieved only if you follow the rules. If you're cheating, you're not a good baseball player. You can't become a good baseball player if you're cheating at baseball. You could become a rich baseball player, right? If you're able to systematically hide the cheating from people, by taking steroids or whatever and getting someone else to do the urine test for you or what have you, as in the past various power hitters have been known to do. But you're not a good baseball player in that way. You have to abide by the rules. But of course, the good of being a good baseball player isn't good anywhere except for within that practice. And a very particular and idiosyncratic practice it is. So that's the idea that MacIntyre has. And so the various activities of the school, the workplace, the sports field are the various practices in which children learn to pursue the good for the sake of the good. The sake of the good that is internal to that practice. And that's the key notion that he has in mind here, which is the notion of a good that is internal to a practice. I mean, we'll recall, of course, the idea of internal goods, which is like the good of being virtuous that it contains within itself. Just being virtuous for its own sake is a good internal to the good life, the virtuous life, as opposed to, let's say, the honors or the rewards, the monetary reward that you might get for being virtuous. That's an external good. The friends you might acquire, that's an external good. Whereas just the goodness of being a generous person in itself is an internal good. So these are goods, he's describing goods in a similar sense, but goods that are internal to our practice. And these include the kinds of things that children are socialized into, whereby they learn this sense of goodness, and they learn to value things as good for their own sake. Includes, he says, activities as different as solving equations, growing vegetables, mending broken machines, playing the clarinet, reading Greek poetry, drawing cartoons, making clay pots, playing soccer. So in these activities, we develop two types of habits. Habits without which we cannot exercise the virtues. So this is the habit, of course, that's going to control the passions, control the appetites, and then also the habit of good practical judgment or prudence. So two types of habits we develop in the context of practice. The habits without which we cannot exercise the virtues, just the basic training of our desires and our reactions and our impulses, our irrational impulses of the appetitive part of the soul, and then the habit of good practical judgment or prudence. To learn a practice, one has to make the achievement of excellence in the practice one's own end, or at least trying, to achieve as much excellence within the practice as you can. You can't learn a practice unless you're really trying to make the achievement of excellence in that practice your own end. This is why, of course, sometimes adults will tell the young that, well, if you cheat at this, you're only cheating yourself. You're only cheating yourself. Why are you only cheating yourself? Because you have to make excellence in that practice, and that is the valuing of the goods internal to the practice, your end in order to get good at the practice. If you skirt around the standards that are internal to that practice by like cheating at a sport or whatever, cheating on exams, cheat on all your math exams, you're never going to become good at solving equations. You're only cheating yourself. That's the idea. So in these activities, we have what MacIntyre calls a double end. We aim to achieve, of course, the end of the activity. We aim, for example, to prove the mathematical equation, to really prove it. We aim to harvest a crop of wheat or help father harvest a crop of wheat, whatever it might be. We aim to win the baseball game. But we also aim to make ourselves into the type of person with the skills and the qualities of mind and character that's capable of accomplishing the end of that activity. We aim to make ourselves a person who has the hand-eye coordination to be able to hit a baseball. We aim to make ourselves a person who has the kind of mental discipline, rigor, attention that enables you to solve a mathematical equation, and so forth. So the two double ends. We're always, as it were, outward directed, working to achieve that end of the activity itself. And then also we're working on ourselves to make ourselves into the type of individuals who can achieve those ends. Often we come only to an adequate idea of the ends of various activities by engaging in the activity. We learn how to think about such ends and to be guided by them in the course of working out how to pursue them in specific circumstances. So he talks at 50 to 51 about how a farmer has to arrive through his or her work at a highly particular set of notions of what good farming is on this particular terrain, in this particular climate, with this kind of plow and this kind of labor force. So a physician is concerned to learn through his or her work how to restore and sustain the health of these patients with these particular vulnerabilities through the use of these pharmacological and surgical resources. We think in particular, how the longer a physician's been at it, the more they will have trained themselves in order to be sensitized to the specificities of particular symptoms in particular types of patients and so forth. So by engaging in activities, our conception of our ends will be refined, maybe even changed. Also, the conception of ourselves is going to be transformed. Besides the problem of integrating rational judgment and desire in pursuit of each of these ends that I choose to pursue, which is something one always has to do, there's another problem. given the wide range of potential practices and various goods to be achieved, how do I know which of these to pursue and how to order them within my life? So I could be a mathematician, I could be a farmer, maybe I'm both. Maybe in the winter months I like to solve mathematical problems, and in the summer I farm. But the question of how to order these various ends is the question of how to achieve excellence as a human being, not just as a mathematician or a farmer. So there's an excellence of a person qua mathematician that would be different from the excellence of a person qua cyclist. But then there's also the excellence of the person qua human being that sort of stands above these particular roles that one occupies. And here MacIntyre thinks, in good Aristotelian fashion, that we need a final end. A final end. Again, this notion is the kind of notion we saw discussed in Aquinas, where final here means the ultimate. We need a final end that enables us to order our other ends, directing the particular ends of the particular practices that one's engaging in during one's life towards a single target. And there will be, he says, 4 features of the final end. First, it must be the end of rational activity as such. Second, it must completely satisfy and perfect the life. Third, it's not any particular good, like pleasure, power, honor, etc. And fourth, it is unqualifiedly good. Those are the 4 characteristics of the final end. It must be the end of rational activity as such. It must completely satisfy and perfect the life of the person who pursues it. It is not any particular good, such as pleasure, power, wealth, honor. And it must be unqualifiedly good, as opposed to good for this or that agent or this or that set of circumstances. Another way to put this would be that the final end must be the measure of goodness. The measure of the goodness for the Neo-Aristotelian is the final end. And MacIntyre gives various examples for historical candidates, or examples, I should say, of historical examples of candidates, that's what I wanted to say, for this final end. So in Plato, this would be the form of the good. In Aristotle, this would be the contemplation of divine things, or that which we contemplate when, insofar as we can, we view things as God views them. We saw that in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, the contemplation of the divine things, the eternal things. In Plotinus, the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus, it's unity with the one. And in Boethius, late ancient, early medieval philosopher Boethius, and in Aquinas, it's the vision of God, the beatitudo, the beatific vision. Before opting for any of these answers, MacIntyre proposes that we first need to consider, quote, the place that the conception of a final end of an ultimate good has in the life of practice. In practice, it's only by making practical decisions and choices that each of us discovers in our own lives a kind of directedness that is our own. The sense of this individual final end is achieved through a narrative by which agents achieve self-awareness and self-knowledge. Now, the Neo-Aristotelian moral agent thinks differently than the expressivist Nietzschean did about the relation between her judgments and her desires on the occasion when she faces some painful conflict. Remember, the idea was that, what should the expressivist do when she's aware that she's committed to some judgments based upon norms that she has up to now accepted, but then on the other hand, she's got a strong desire that tells her to do something contrary to what the norm tells her to do. So what is the Neo-Aristotelian going to do when faced with that conflict? And how does that differ from the way the Nietzschean would respond to that conflict? MacIntyre describes a process of practical reasoning, it's on page 55, that the agent will engage in. So he says that she will entertain two practical syllogisms with incompatible conclusions. She'll ask, what is the best case for judging her desire to be generally desirable? So on the one hand, it's sort of like, this is the advice that sometimes you're given if you're faced with a difficult choice. Make a list on both sides, right? Except in a philosophical way, MacIntyre is recommending that you make an argument of the practical syllogism. You could try to make the best argument, the best case you could make that would issue in your choosing that particular end. So you start with the thing that your desire tells you should do. What's the best case for judging this desire to be generally desirable? And then, what's the best argument for the conclusion that you should act otherwise than what your desire urges you to do? Right? So you have this desire to leave and be the drummer in a rock band, which is something you always wanted to do. But meanwhile, you're married, you have a job here, you have to support your your spouse and your young child. What should you do? So you entertain practical syllogisms with the incompatible conclusions, giving the best argument for leaving with the rock band and giving the best argument for staying and taking care of your child, not abandoning your family. So that's the first stage. You make a practical syllogism or an argument on either side, and then you will ask how the goods mentioned in the premises of those two arguments, those two syllogisms, are to be rank ordered by a rational agent exercising virtues of temperance, courage, justice, and prudence. So you're going to have some kind of argument that's going to describe the goods that you hope to achieve in either of these courses of action, and you're going to ask, how do I rank those goods? And not just how I do, but how would a person who's a temperate person, who's a courageous person, who's a just person, who's a prudent person, how would that person rank those goods? And then she'll ask if the way she will be rank ordering them, if she acts as her desire tells her to, is consistent with the continuing exercise of the virtues that will direct her towards her final good as she understands it. So those are the stages of practical reasoning of a Neo-Aristotelian agent. A further stage is what MacIntyre calls higher order reflection on her practical thinking. So we've got this practical thinking. What should I do? Follow my desire or follow what my, the norm that I accept tells me I should do? I make an argument for each side. I rank order the goods. I consider how a virtuous person would rank those goods, and I consider what would happen if I followed my desire. That's my practical thinking. But then I can also reflect on that practical thinking, which is what we're doing and talking about it in essence, and try to articulate the theoretical presuppositions of the various stances I take, the various goods I take to be goods. And this may lead to, as it did in Aristotle and Aquinas, to the conclusion that her practical reasoning does have theoretical presuppositions. And we could try to articulate those in terms of the human function and so forth. So that's the Neo-Aristotelian conception of the rational agent and how the rational agent would engage in practical reasoning that MacIntyre puts forward. All this deliberation, he also adds, needs to be made in consultation with others who are able to correct our human tendency to self-deception, partiality, bias, one-sidedness. This is where good friendship comes in. The need for shared rational deliberation requires that moral agents living in community observe certain moral precepts. So I also have to take into consideration other people, voices of other people, and give them equal weight. And refrain from violence and other forms of coercion, refrain from fraud and untruthfulness that could distort their considerations. And this means that the guiding life narrative of the Neo-Aristotelian rational agent. So we're back to this idea. Remember, the Nietzscheans, and faced with this choice, they're going to make the choice between reason and desire, between norms and strong desire. They're going to make it in light of a kind of narrative conception of their identity and who they are. And MacIntyre says that there's going to be a guiding life narrative of the Neo-Aristotelian rational agent as well. And this is going to involve a number of aspects that it might be helpful to catalog here. So this is the guiding life narrative of the Neo-Aristotelian rational agent. And that's going to involve such thing as identifying herself with groups and communities. Also, a narrative of learning from failures. Remember that the trying to achieve one's idea of human flourishing and failing, which causes one to learn, to adjust, and so on. Moving toward common goods. Because of this sense that one is ensconced in various practices with others working cooperatively in various groups and communities, one is going to be moving towards common goods. This is, of course, Aristotelian in the sense that Aristotle is always going to see the ethical life as taking place within a political context, a social context. And a story of increasing integration of individual and common goods as well. So as one moves through life, one's individual good comes to more and more be integrated with the common good. For example, when you start a family, right? Or when you get more and more responsibility at work, your good becomes more and more integrated with the common good. And then finally, there's going to be a teleological end-driven narrative. You see this as moving towards something, towards, raising children, towards accomplishing some kind of goal at work, some goal you want your company to, place where you want your company to get to, and so forth. Establishing a restaurant or whatever. So there's going to be, and how all of this integrates with one's idea of what human flourishing in general is. So these are the guiding aspects of the guiding life narrative of the Neo-Aristotelian rational agent. Now, the main contrast with the Nietzschean is that whereas the Nietzschean finds moral constraints to be unfreedom of the spirit, the Neo-Aristotelian will find moral constraints to be enabling. The Neo-Aristotelian will think that Nietzsche has deliberately excluded himself from those types of practices and relationships through which we learn to become practically rational agents and to exercise the virtues. The Nietzschean denies himself the possibility of understanding what it is to be a moral agent by impoverishing his moral experience. So this leads to the first discussion question. In contrasting the Nietzschean expressivist and the Neo-Aristotelian, MacIntyre highlights how the former views moral constraints as a source of unfreedom and conformity to them as weakness, while the latter, the Neo-Aristotelian, views them, moral constraints, as enabling and personally fulfilling. Explain which position you think has more to be said in favor of it and why. So once again, first discussion question. In contrasting the Nietzschean expressivist on the one hand and the Neo-Aristotelian on the other, MacIntyre highlights how the Nietzschean views moral constraints as a source of unfreedom, and conformity to them as weakness. That's what the Nietzschean thinks. Well, the Neo-Aristotelian, on the other hand, views moral constraints as enabling and personally fulfilling. So explain which position you think has more to be said in favor of it and why. And of course, you'll want to think about the different perspectives that the Nietzschean expressivists and the Neo-Aristotelian have and the basis for their views and how they come into conflict. Section 9, Expressivist versus Neo-Aristotelian, a philosophical conflict in which neither party seems to defeat the other. So there's some crucial differences we've seen between expressivists and Neo-Aristotelians. The histories, the life narratives of expressivists are histories of their affections, their feelings, of what they care about, how they came to come to care about it. That's what the life narrative of Nietzschean is, what I care about, how I came to care about it. The histories of Neo-Aristotelians are histories of how they succeeded or failed at becoming better judges of what it is for a human being to flourish. So that's the important difference. Nietzschean expressivists, they're going to see their life history as sort of, well, I cared about this, then I came to not care about it anymore, and then I came to care about this, and I came to care about this other thing. And my desire changed in this way and that way. Whereas the history of Neo-Aristotelians are going to be, well, I tried to achieve this good within this practice because I thought it would lead to, being a good person in this way. And then I failed at that for these reasons. And from this, I learned this. And then I adjusted my idea of what it was to be a good person and tried this other way of achieving that and so on. And so there are going to be histories of how they succeeded or failed at becoming better judges of what it is for a human being to flourish. In the Nietzschean case, the standard, of course, is completely subjective of whether the life is a good life or not. It's just a matter of whether I could achieve my desires, whether I could get what I cared about, whether I could pursue what I wanted to do, and so forth. Whereas for the Neo-Aristotelian, it's going to be whether I met standards that were independent of me. So they're concerned with different questions in many ways. They ask themselves different things. One aspect of this is that, as MacIntyre sees it, the Nietzschean is going to have a much more first-personal, singular way of posing these questions, which is, what do I want, right? How do I feel about this? Whereas the Neo-Aristotelian is going to say, well, what will be good for us? What should we do? Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that the expressivists can't cooperate with others and so on, but they're going to cooperate in the sense because they chose it, because of the way they feel about something. Whereas the Neo-Aristotelian is going to choose to cooperate with others because they see it as something that is a good, that is necessary for human flourishing. Because of these different perspectives, when the Neo-Aristotelian and the expressivists confront one another, they're unlikely to have fruitful exchanges, MacIntyre thinks. One main difference is in their attitude towards relationships, as I've already hinted at. For the Neo-Aristotelian, relationships are essential to achieving common goods necessary for developing powers for human flourishing. Whereas for the expressivist, such relationships are merely expressions of her attitudes, concerns, and feelings that she cares about. She would immediately remake her relationships if they cease to express her desires. The Neo-Aristotelian's history is a history of we, whereas the expressivist history is a history of the individual, of I. So in sum, there are three levels of disagreement between the expressivist and the Neo-Aristotelian. First, there are first-order practical disagreements over how to best resolve particular conflicts between desires or between desires and practical judgments. That's what we saw in the contrast between the way the Nietzschean is going to deal with this conflict between what my norm tells me I should accept and what my desire is, and how the Neo-Aristotelian deals with the conflict between judgment and desire. So there's the first-order practical disagreement over how to resolve these particular conflicts between our desires themselves. First of all, how should we rank order them? Describe two different ways in which that should be done, either this kind of Nietzschean artistic way of rank ordering my desires, or in this more Thomistic way of constructing two arguments and asking how the virtuous person would view these goods and so on. So there's going to be different at that level. But then there's also going to be this kind of second order philosophical disagreement over how these practical judgments are to be interpreted and how practical reasoning itself is to be understood. And then, of course, third, there's going to be disagreements about how the agent's moral history is to be recounted. And in this last point, we get a key claim that MacIntyre makes, namely that by understanding themselves in expressivist terms, Nietzscheans, expressivists, are unable to reckon with important aspects of themselves. Their activities can only be characterized and understood adequately in neo-Aristotelian terms. Their own histories of themselves, the expressivist history of themselves, will be defective histories. There's quite a strong claim. This sort of Nietzschean life narrative, this artistically constructed life narrative, is going to be a defective story. And so the implication is that the expressivist and the Nietzschean cannot achieve the same degree of self-knowledge as the neo-Aristotelian. Now you recognize, of course, that from the expressivist perspective, they're just going to brush this charge off and say, well, you neo-Aristotelians, you think you've got a richer understanding of what your life is all about in terms of these supposed successes and failures and so on, but these are just histories of obfuscation and error because they're based upon your believing that there are these objective standards out there that really aren't there and so forth. So you're just obfuscating your life. You're just muddying the waters. So the two perspectives they can continue to shout at each other all day across this divide. There appears to be a philosophical impasse here. But there are still questions that can be asked, MacIntyre thinks. One is, what conditions would have to be satisfied for you to acknowledge that the central theses of the view you now hold are mistaken? In other words, what would falsify your view? That's one question that could be asked of both the expressivist and the neo-Aristotelian. What would falsify these views? What would convince them that their view is mistaken? And another is, how does each type of theory function as a mode of self-knowledge within those particular social contexts in which they're characteristically at home? How do they lead to misunderstandings about oneself and one's social role? And that's a little bit obscure here, but it will become clear as we go on through the later chapters. So there's still questions about, you can ask both of these views, what would falsify it for you? What would lead you to believe that you were mistaken about your view, your expressivism or your neo-Aristotelianism? And then how does each theory function as a mode of self-knowledge within those social contexts in which it's at home? Do they lead to misunderstandings about oneself and one's social role? Okay, this leads to a second discussion question. Do you agree with MacIntyre's claim that the Nietzschean expressivist necessarily must have a defective self-understanding rooted in the defective life narrative that she tells herself? Is the neo-Aristotelian type of life history really superior? Or, as the Nietzschean would claim, is it filled with self-obfuscation and error? Explain your answers. So, second discussion question, do you agree with MacIntyre's claim that the Nietzschean expressivist necessarily must have a defective self-understanding rooted in the defective life narrative that she tells herself? Is the neo-Aristotelian type of life history really superior? Or, as the Nietzschean would claim, is it filled with self-obfuscation and error? Explain your answers. So in closing, MacIntyre addresses the question, why have I put on one side not only the philosophical standpoints of most recent moral philosophers, but also their moral standpoint? That is, why am I just focusing on these two views when there are other views out there besides neo-Aristotelianism and expressivism? Why am I taking these two to be the most interesting? And his answer is that he regards the subject matter of contemporary moral philosophy as problematic. And the name he gives this subject matter, the subject matter of contemporary moral philosophy, is morality with a capital M. Morality with a capital M. And this is inspired largely by Bernard Williams' critique in the work called Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. This work here from Bernard Williams, Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, who discuss the morality. Morality is described on page 65. That subject matter they, contemporary moral philosophers, take to be morality with a capital M. A set of rules, ideals, and judgments concerning duties and obligations that are to be distinguished from religious, legal, political, and aesthetic rules, ideals, and judgments. Next paragraph. It is presented as a set of impersonal rules entitled to the assent of any rational agent whatsoever, enjoining obedience to such maxims as those that prohibit the taking of innocent life and theft, and those that require at least some large degree of truthfulness and at least some significant measure of altruistic benevolence. You might think, well, hasn't this been what we're talking about, morality? And MacIntyre's point is that this has become so natural for us to think of as the subject matter of ethical theory as such that it often becomes invisible to us. But it will become clear as he goes through this sort of historical account in the succeeding chapters. This explains how this idea of morality is actually something very particular. And one aspect of this is the idea that this is some kind of relatively isolated, self-contained entity that moral philosophers can study in abstraction from the particular socio-historical context in which morality plays itself out. He notes that morality, in this sense, is not just the fetish of academic moral philosophers, it's also believed in by people in everyday life. And one characteristic of this is that it seems beset by what seems to be an inescapable tension between deontological moral rules and the imperative to maximize well-being. Deontological moral rules would be just sort of absolute moral rules that aren't concerned with the consequences. They're just things that you must do because it is commanded or obligatory that you do them, like the Ten Commandments. And then, of course, that is often in conflict with maximizing well-being, as we saw in the discussion of Mill's utilitarianism. In everyday moral life, these tensions are settled by indefiniteness and oscillation between the two poles, between deontological rules on the one hand and maximizing utility on the other. In the academic context, moral philosophers often insist that they can resolve these difficulties theoretically, but MacIntyre clearly regards this as a futile pursuit. The contending parties are not getting any closer to agreement on the major issues. It's similar to the disagreements between liberals and conservatives in politics. There's no progress being made in that. And one reason MacIntyre finds expressivism interesting is that it provides an explanation for this. It says, well, morality is just the expression of pre-rational attitudes that one has. And so, it's like why some people for some unknown reason tend to be liberals. Other people for some unknown reason tend to be conservatives. It's a similar situation with regard to whether you're, a utilitarian or some kind of a deontological moral theorist. So we seem to be in an expressivist culture, yet unable to acknowledge this fact about ourselves. This leads MacIntyre to sidestep conventional academic moral philosophy in favor of a radical investigation into the social roots of modern morality and its impasses. And this is what we will see in the chapters to follow.